So when people are getting married, no one ever really wants to think about the possibility of that relationship coming to an end. It doesn't feel terribly romantic.
And when you say they're not legally binding, then what do you mean?
If you enter into a prenuptial agreement, there is no guarantee that in the event of a divorce and in the event that there is a disagreement between you, that a court will apply that prenuptial agreement 100%.
So if you are wondering about what you need to do to prepare from a family law perspective for finding and holding on to your property, then this is going to be a perfect video for you. Stay tuned. Hi everyone, Arinzeh here with Onyx Property Team in Keller Williams. Thank you so much for checking out another episode on my YouTube channel. As you know, I love bringing you lifestyle videos about living in London, in this incredible city. But as a property agent, I also specialize in putting out videos about the London property market and what's happening. I specialize as a buying agent, and so that means often working with buyers, but also sellers as well, and helping them navigate their property needs. So we've got a special guest on today because oftentimes buying property or living in a home is ultimately about the dynamics of our lives, whether we're going through a divorce or growing a home or relocating. That is often going to drive why we might need a new home or why we might need to sell. So what I wanted to do on this episode was invite in a family law solicitor to help us talk a little bit about the dynamics of owning a home or dealing with property as it relates to some of life's changes that might impact family. So with that, Ben, I would love to introduce our guest on today's episode, which is Emilie Helm. And Emilie is a family law solicitor, and she has newly launched her practice on her own. So I'd love for Emilie to introduce herself, give us a little bit about her background, and then we'll dive into today's conversation.
Hi, Ugo. Thank you so much for inviting me here to chat to you. So I am half French and half English. You perhaps can't tell because I don't sound very French when I'm speaking, but I do speak French fluently. So as you said, I work as a family lawyer and I specialize in cases which have an international element to them. Being half French and speaking French, it does mean that I work with a lot of Anglo-French couples or Anglo-European clients. And it can be related to divorce, to children, to prenuptial agreements. We tend to deal with most issues, and often we'll work with other professionals around the world, whether that's lawyers or property agents or tax specialists. So as you said, I've recently gone down the self-employed route, which is fantastic. And I consult for a wonderful boutique law firm, which is called MBS Family Law. And we really do specialize in international cases. We're a small group. We all speak fluent French. And so if you want to check us out, you can come and have a look at www.mbsfamilylaw.com.
Well, thank you for your introduction. We'll definitely be including all of your contact details on the show notes as well as in the video as well. So thank you for the perspective. And I love that you've got that international perspective because so many of our clients, especially in locations like London, will be international. So you might be able to speak to that dynamic as well. But with that, again, if this is your first time on my channel, please consider subscribing. We put out weekly videos about the London property market and living in this incredible city. And also, if you do like this video, make sure to hit that like button at the end. So with that, let's dive in, Emilie, to talk a little bit about for couples who own and plan to get married, what do they need to think about when they are thinking about property?
So when people are getting married, no one ever really wants to think about the possibility of that relationship coming to an end. It doesn't feel terribly romantic or very positive. But actually being able to have honest conversations about that can be really important because on a divorce, all assets, so property, bank accounts, trust funds, whatever it might be, everything is taken into consideration. And there's no guarantee that someone will exit a marriage with the property that they brought into the marriage. Okay. Yeah. So, and a lot of people I think don't realize that. So, if you're in a relationship and you're thinking about getting married and you've got property that you might want to ring fence in the event of a divorce, which hopefully will never happen, what we generally advise people to do is to consider entering into a prenuptial agreement. And that's essentially an agreement between both parties, which will set out the financial consequences, i.e., what will happen to those assets on divorce.
Thanks for that perspective. I know, again, maybe for our American clients, it's almost state by state will dictate
Yes.
what rules are and communal property and, you know, that type of thing. But I think that the point to stress, as you've mentioned, is there's no guarantee that you can exit the marriage with the same assets that you entered in with unless you've had that prenuptial agreement agreed and signed in place. Fair enough?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary there.
Okay, perfect. So then what happens if you go into the marriage and ends up dissolving and you don't have a prenup in place?
Okay, so as I said before, on a divorce, the court is required by law, it's written in statute, that it has to take into account all the property of each party, regardless of whether it was something that was gifted or inherited or acquired before they got married. So on a divorce, both parties will have a strong claim to share, usually equally, in the fruits of the marriage. And what we mean by that is the property that was built up during the marriage. And we tend to call that matrimonial property. And that will usually, nine times out of 10, that will include the family home, regardless of how, when, and by whom it was bought. You know, that's included. So the parties might then have a slightly less strong claim to share in what we call the non-matrimonial property, i.e. the property that was acquired before the marriage or gifted. And really what's going to happen to assets which were acquired before the marriage is really highly fact specific. So there's no sort of specific set of rules. So if it's a case where sharing in those assets that were built up during the marriage isn't going to meet the needs of the parties, and quite often what we mean by that is the financially weaker party, then those needs need to be prioritized. And that might mean redistributing the non-matrimonial property. You do also have situations where, and you probably see this a lot, that someone might enter into a marriage with a property, so it's their property beforehand. And let's not say it's the family home. Let's say it's a property abroad that they treat as a holiday home. And so they think, yeah, that's mine. It's in my name. That's it. But actually, during the marriage, that property, you know, it becomes their holiday home. And let's be stereotypical here. Let's say it's the husband's property and the wife, she's actually spent loads of time renovating it, managing projects, increasing the value of that property. Well, over time, that asset isn't really going to necessarily be considered non-matrimonial because it's changed, it's really performed a part of the marriage. And so, you know, there's that element as well, that the longer a marriage continues, the longer a marriage endures, the source of the asset becomes less important. So there's so much to think about, and it's not really clear cut. And that can actually be why prenuptial agreements are becoming more and more popular, because although they're not legally binding in this jurisdiction, people want to be able to have a bit more certainty and a bit more control over what happens if things don't work out.
And when you say they're not legally binding, then what do you mean?
So they're not, if you enter into a prenuptial agreement, there is no guarantee that in the event of a divorce and in the event that there is a disagreement between you, that a court will apply that prenuptial agreement 100%.
Okay.
It's just one circumstance that the court has to take into account.
Okay. All right. So at least you've created your intentions, and both parties
Yes.
stating these were our intentions. So, you know, a judge or a court might be hard pressed to completely overlook that, but they do not have to absolutely accept that prenuptial agreement as a binding contract.
Exactly. I think it's, you know, the aim of the court is to achieve a fair result, and fairness is quite an elastic term, and it's going to mean one thing to one person and something else to someone else. And so the court has a discretion. It's going to apply all of the factors to try and reach a fair result. And, there's a good chance that a prenuptial agreement, if, both parties have had legal advice, they properly understand the agreement, they properly understood what the assets were at the time, there's a good chance that it will be upheld, but no one can give you a cast iron guarantee.
I had a friend, funny enough, who inherited a family home.
Yeah.
It had been in her family for generations in Martha's Vineyard in the States. And that became contentious during the divorce situation. So in that situation, can you avoid that, especially if it's, say, something that's been generationally in the family name or lineage, then that could potentially get lost if there's a divorce. So would that mean more a situation where somebody might want to put it in a trust that's outside of the marriage, or loan it to a family member or something like that?
I mean, it's tricky. It's tricky. I think you would definitely want to have a prenuptial agreement in that situation. And ultimately, it comes down to being able to meet the needs of the party. But I think if you're very clear about what those needs are, and there's ways to meet that, then the courts would try exceptionally hard to keep that property ring fenced. Something which has been in a family for generations, they understand the importance of that and that it does fall outside of the marriage. But there is this question of needs in English law, and you can't leave someone dependent on the state purse. They need to be able to have their needs met within the context of the case.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. And does children and having children change the dynamics of anything you've said? Obviously, typically that does have significant impact, but yeah.
I mean, I think children changes everything, doesn't it? And so, yes, it's really relevant because children tends to be the court's first consideration when a couple are going through a divorce. And deciding how you can apply that principle can actually be really challenging because income and capital that's sufficient to run one household during the marriage may well be insufficient to run two households during a divorce. So where the resources are limited, the priority tends to be to provide accommodation for children for their minority, and that will be with the primary carer. So the primary carer's needs are likely to be prioritized. And sometimes what happens actually is that the other parent might receive their interest in the property years later down the line. So there might be an agreement that when the youngest child turns 18 or finishes secondary education, at that point, the house will be sold and the other parent gets their interest in the property at that point. So, the primary care really is prioritized in terms of needs. But at the same time, the court also doesn't want there to be a huge disparity between the parents. It's just a fact that children are always going to gravitate. If there's one house which has got swimming pool and gyms and home cinemas, and the other one is a tiny little flat, the children are always going to gravitate to the nicer property. So, in trying to achieve fairness, they take all of that into account.
Interesting. Okay, definitely good perspective there. And with the dynamics of the property market always changing, have you seen changes from the impact on Brexit at all?
Yes, I mean, in a nutshell, Brexit has just created less certainty and potentially more litigation. So when you're thinking about it in the divorce context, pre-Brexit, where you had two competing jurisdictions, and by that we mean two countries in which you could potentially divorce. So let's say England and France. It used to be a question of first come, first served, which would guarantee the country in which you could divorce. And so back in the day, we used to have what we called the Eurostar divorce, where you might have a couple in France, and the wife would quickly get on the Eurostar, come to England, and provided she could get divorced in England, quickly make her application, because England has always been known as the divorce capital of the world, and tends to be quite generous to the financially weaker party. This rule no longer applies in terms of first come, first served. And so what happens is that if you do have competing jurisdictions, competing countries, it's going to be a question of which country is the most appropriate. And inevitably, that can lead to disagreement and more litigation and more costs. The other thing to think about, and particularly in the context of property, is that if you do reach an agreement and you have that agreement embodied in what we call a court order, let's say there's orders in relation to property abroad, what you need to make sure is that that other country is going to respect and recognize that order, and if necessary, enforce it. And the rules in relation to enforcement post Brexit have changed, and so it's really important when you're a family with properties and assets in different countries that you're getting advice from the lawyers in those countries early on to make sure you're thinking about all of these different things.
That's going to get probably pretty complicated, I know. So again, if somebody more from, again, we deal with a lot of Americans, say we're married in America, they're living here now, but in the situation where they have no assets, this would be the place they can legally divorce, right? So it's, if you're physically here or residing here, that would, okay. But then if there's an element of owning property, say back in America or something like that, that is part of the, I guess, the estate, then the marital estate, then that would be, could be decided on by a judge here. But then the question is, let's say if they say you have to sell it for purposes of the financial well-being of both parties, then that has to get honored, I guess, on the US side.
Exactly. So you would want to start working with, US lawyers, and obviously US lawyers in the relevant state quite early on, just to understand, how, whether they're going to recognize an English order, and, you might need to have particular wording in place. And also just, when you're dealing with other countries, there can be quite a lot of delays if you're dealing with lots of third parties. So you want to start that ball rolling as soon as possible to try and avoid that.
Fair enough. From our side, we often, not often, but we do support and help clients, even on the other side, once they've decided to split, then that means, as you said, you're going from one single household to two. So we've worked with several divorcees and helped them, and it can be a very emotional time for people. So that's, again, one of the things I think as service providers, we need to be particularly sensitive to the dynamics of the fact that this is not just transactional. This is heavily can be very emotional for people. It can mean change of home and lifestyle and everything else. So that's something that, again, having worked with says that you really have to bring up, think, an extra heightened levels of sensitivity to support them through that tough chapter.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, property does tend to be really emotive, particularly the family home. There's so many memories there. And, often the feeling is that, if it's sold, if there are children, the children are going to find that really destabilizing. So it can be very difficult for people to come to terms with the fact that a property might need to be sold, to make sure there are resources available to everyone. And the reality is sometimes in those kind of cases where the conflict is quite high, sometimes it can be used as a bit of a bargaining tool, and it's a difficult. It can get very difficult, and it can get very tricky.
Yeah, and you just one situation we had, I found that almost you can sabotage your choices for the next home because there's so much emotional connection to the home where you've raised your children, and you've spent almost a lifetime. So again, it's really being sensitive to those dynamics. So with that, then, is there any final tips you would add for people as they think about, I know you said having those honest, open conversations is really important, but perhaps just as with anything, you nobody wants the worst case scenario, but certainly finding yourself in the worst case scenario, you often wish you had planned a little bit better or thought things out a little bit better. So any other thoughts from, what you see in your practice and how you work with clients?
You know what? I was having a chat with a colleague about this the other day, is we would love to be able to get to a point where lots of clients don't come to us saying, if only I had, if only I had known this, or if only I had known that, or done this or done that. And none of us can crystal ball gaze, and life always throws challenges that you have to weather as you go along. But particularly when it comes to property, just have a think about what it is you're intending, what it is that you're hoping. You know, if you're buying a property, for example, do you want to own that property together jointly, you know, on an equal footing? Or actually, if you're putting different contributions into that property, do you want that to be reflected in the ownership? You know, think about things like what happens if one of you is, you know, going to spend loads of money on the property to do it up and make it really lovely. Does that need to be reflected? I think it's super important when you're setting out on this partnership with whoever it is that you've decided to do it, to just make sure you're really aligned in terms of your values, your goals, your hopes, what it is you want for the future. And if you can have those really open and honest conversations, which might be really difficult, it hopefully does build a really good foundation so that you're better able to weather those storms and challenges that life throws your way. And inevitably they will come, because, you know, life it's a roller coaster.
Absolutely. It's a journey, and there, as I like to, different chapters and seasons to it. And I think, you know, maybe as a final comment, you do coaching as part of the work you do. I think, again, that's part of what I really resonated with me when we met, was the benefits. Again, it's always not about just litigating your way through, but, you know, how do you help set people up for the best level of success in that arena as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think it's now becoming common practice that when people talk about divorce, a lot of people say that actually it's 95% emotional and only 5% legal. And it's really important to actually try to understand those emotions quite early on and what it's telling you, because, you know, when it's been a long marriage, you've been together, you know, whether you've had kids or you haven't, you know, a lot of people lose a sense of self in that situation, and even more so when they're going through a divorce. And, you know, what I think is really important is to try and reconnect with yourself and understand what those values are, you know, what is important to you, and, you know, remember what you're good at, what you enjoy, and start, you know, a divorce is, you know, a separation of kind, but if you can start rebuilding yourself really early on, and when you get to the end of the process, it can just be less of a shock, because, you know, hopefully you might be excited about the next chapter, but if you're not there yet in terms of that, at least you just feel like you've got the tools to be able to, you know, get through it and, you know, get to that point where you can actually start enjoying life again and thinking about what it is you want.
Well, that's a great, I think, comment or sentiment to end the conversation on. Thank you again so much, Emilie. I think you've given us definitely some great nuggets to think about as people consider marriage, or, you know, sadly, potentially divorce, but the dynamics, how it impacts the property side. Obviously, from my perspective, as I've mentioned, if there is property involved and you would like support in that, whether it's finding the next rental property or the next home or having to sell, we work, you know, really from a very hands-on approach with our clients. And I think, as I said, again, during that challenging times, that's hopefully what you is quite beneficial to people. So again, we'll be putting Emilie's contact details in the show notes, as well as on the hopefully on a screen somewhere. And I welcome you again. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, let YouTube know that we're putting out great content, and make sure to subscribe, because we put out weekly videos about the London property market and the lifestyle and incredible things to enjoy. I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button. And if it's your first time on my channel, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss a single episode, as we put out weekly videos about the London property market and living in this incredible city.